So the goal for today is to try to explain some of the changes that are in React-Redux version 8, which I will hopefully release within the next couple weeks. And I actually really wanted to spend the majority of today doing actual live coding work. So I'll try to limit some of my explanatory time to maybe half an hour or so. And we all know that it's pretty easy for me to keep going about stuff. So I'll try to keep myself limited to about that much amount of time. Let's see. So let's start with a recap of what is actually in React-Redux version 8. So I put up another one of these roadmap issues last summer, and in contrast to version 7, which was a major internal rewrite, V8 is kind of simpler conceptually. So there were really three major areas that we were trying to work on. One was to improve compatibility with React 18's concurrent rendering behavior. The second was to actually convert the React-Redux source to TypeScript itself. And the third was doing some code cleanup to remove some options and APIs that were really no longer relevant and or being used. So let me do kind of a quick walkthrough, well, hopefully quick walkthrough of what we've actually done so far in relation to those three areas. And then we'll talk about some of the actual code implementation that's involved. So the first thing that we did was actually working on converting the code to TypeScript. Historically, React-Redux has always been written in plain JavaScript, and the type definitions for React-Redux were always maintained by the community over indefinitely typed. And frankly, this was a good thing, because up until like mid-2019, I really had little to no TypeScript experience myself, and people would actually file TypeScript-related issues on the Redux repos, and I would look at it and like, I have no idea what's going on here, I can't help with this, and move on. But over the last couple years, I've gotten a lot better at TypeScript myself, and Redux Toolkit is actually written in TypeScript, and so I've become more comfortable working on it at the library level. So one of the big goals for version 8 was I wanted to actually port the entire React-Redux code base to TypeScript as part of our work, and really I wanted that work done before we started doing any actual development work on the code base for version 8. So I like right about the same time I put up that roadmap issue, I put up another issue saying, I want to convert the code base to TypeScript. And I basically put out a big call for help on Twitter and said, would anybody from the community like to help us do this? And happily, a lot of folks actually popped in and said, yes. So I just went ahead and created an integration branch and said, if anyone would like to start converting any of our code to TypeScript, just go for it, make a branch, start filing PRs, and let's do this. And if you were to look through the history of this issue over the next several weeks, a lot of people contributed to this. Like people were just doing like one or two files at a time. And over the next few weeks, we got the entire source code section converted to TypeScript. The unit test took a little longer, but we got all those done as well. So I ended up making a branch for the existing version 7 code to leave that as is. And then we continued using master for all the actual development. So the key thing here was I knew that we were going to be doing a bunch of changes internally, and I really wanted to have all the code converted to TypeScript before we started shuffling any of those pieces around. So we got that merged in yeah, see that really only took about a month. So we got that merged in July, and since then the rest of the actual development work has been happening right there on master. The second thing that we wanted to do was actually try to clean up a couple of unused, well, relatively unused pieces of the code base. When React-Redux version 5 came out in late 2016, the guy who contributed basically the entire rewrite split up the work, the implementation of the connect API into two pieces. The actual connect function that all of you have used and seen over the last few years is actually a wrapper around a lower level API called connectAdvanced that is kind of more generic. So connect specifically has the options for map state, map dispatch, merge props, etc. Whereas connectAdvanced simply takes a single function that gets, I think, the state and dispatch, and then it's up to you to provide a function that figures out how to turn those into props. And this had some usage over the years, but really very few people even knew that it existed. And having that split internally in the code base made some of the implementation more complicated. So we had actually filed an issue all the way back in 2019 saying that connectAdvanced was deprecated and we really didn't want to use it. And whenever our next major version came out, we would actually look at removing it. You'll note that this was actually prior to the announcement of React hooks, which happened in October 2019. So this was on my list of stuff to remove for version 8. And I did that in, actually July, right after the TypeScript PR had been merged in. So this PR, I went in and I ripped out the connectAdvanced specific logic and merged in, kind of mashed together the connect wrapper behavior with the rest of the behavior inside of the connectAdvanced file. Shortly after, I was starting to work on some of the React 18 compatibility code, and I noticed that all of our tests for the pure option were no longer working. And let's see, where did that go? Oh, I think that was in the compatibility behavior. Yep. Let me describe what this pure option was. Way back in the day, 2015, when React-Redux was first being worked on, there were a lot more weird interop scenarios for React at the time. For example, you had people using backbone models to pass data into React. You had people trying to migrate over from Angular 1 and so on. And the idea that your component was only supposed to depend on props and state for rendering hadn't fully sunk in yet. So there were a lot more cases where people might be actually mutating data in some way, and then actually still wanting to re-render their React components and have it render with the correct data. By default, Connect wraps your component so that it only re-renders when the incoming props and data have actually changed. And this pure option could be set to false if you wanted it to re-render every time there was a dispatch, regardless of whether or not the incoming props would actually change. And this was sort of a compatibility hack for cases where you might have like some kind of external mutable piece of data that would be read while rendering and that might have changed and that the component wouldn't know about it. So you would need to force a re-render just to reread that other piece of data. In practice, nobody has used this over the last few years. The React ecosystem has changed. People now consistently use plain JS data. We know we aren't supposed to mutate. And as I started working on this compatibility code for React 18, all the tests for the pure option started breaking. I'm like, you know what? This is a great time to rip out that code and stop worrying about it. So as part of the React 18 compatibility work, I ripped out connectAdvanced and I ripped out the pure option. So the big work for version 8, as far as the compatibility, was switching the internals of our code base to use this new useSyncExternalStore API in React 18. So the background on this is that React-Redux has always worked by subscribing directly to the Redux store. And other than version 6, when we tried an alternate approach, the work of subscribing to the store and checking your selectors after a dispatch has been done outside of the React components. And this worked fine as long as React's rendering behavior was one big, long, synchronous execution sequence. But React 18 changes that with its new concurrent rendering behavior. Now, the process of a single render pass for React can be broken up into multiple chunks of work. So if you've got a lot of components and it's taking a long time to render all of them, React might render maybe like the top half of the tree, and then it's burned enough time, like 15, 20 milliseconds or whatever, that it decides to pause and let the browser actually process some events. Or maybe while it's paused, maybe it was processing an update from an incoming AJAX request or something relatively low priority. A higher priority event comes in, like the user starting to type into a text box. And now React has to set aside the work in progress render, complete the much higher priority render pass, finish that, update the page, and then go back to what it was working on and kind of like do a git rebase, put that on top of the changes that it made from the input work, and then pick up where it left off. Now, what happens if the first half of the render pass reads Redux state A, but somewhere during that break, another action is dispatched, the Redux store is updated, and now the second half of the tree reads a different Redux state. You've got a mismatch, even though it's all within one overall render pass. And this problem is called tearing. There was a really good talk by Flarney Marchand at React Next back in 2019, where she gave some examples of what this tearing problem is and why it can create problems. So the React team originally designed a new API called useMutableSource that was supposed to try to fix this tearing issue. And the idea was libraries could use this API in part of their implementation and address that. But during the React 18 alpha process, we had some discussions back and forth in the React working group, and we eventually concluded that useMutableSource had some problems with the API design and it wasn't sufficient. So the React team went back to the drawing board and they came up with a different API called useSyncExternalStore. And they spent a bunch of time implementing this. And React-Redux actually ended up being the test bed for this API. So if you look at this particular pull request right here, and you look at the commits and the comment history, you can actually see a lot of back and forth between myself and Andrew Clark, where Andrew said, okay, here's an alpha version of useSyncExternalStore, and I'd play around with it and update the pull request and say, oh, nope, this test is failing, useSyncExternalStore doesn't cover this use case. And Andrew would go back and play around with it, push up another alpha build, I'd try it out and say, okay, that fixes this problem, but there's this other thing that it doesn't handle. And so we had this whole back and forth. And the idea was that React-Redux was really serving as a test bed for this API. And if it works good enough for React-Redux, it ought to work well enough for all the other libraries in the ecosystem. So in one sense, the API was being designed specifically for what React-Redux needed, but really we were acting as a test bed for all the other libraries in the ecosystem as a result. So there was a lot of really interesting discussion and back and forth in this particular pull request. Now, because useSyncExternalStore is a new API that's only in React 18, the React team decided to put out what's called a shim package. And this is a version of the useSyncExternalStore function that's actually implemented outside of the React core library itself and available as a package on NPM. And in fact, that shim package works all the way back to React 16.8, as long as every version of React that has hooks. And this pull request started by using the shim, since the shim was available before Andrew actually implemented the code in React 18 itself. But later on, I went in and I updated the internals of the code base to only use the API directly from React 18 itself. And my assumption at the time was that if you're going to upgrade to React-Redux version 8, you're probably upgrading to React 18 at the same time. And so I made it that there was a hard dependency on React 18. React-Redux version 8 beta would not work with React 17 and 16. Sometime later, there was a discussion on Twitter, and people pointed out that it might still be helpful to have this work with the earlier versions of React, but the shim adds about a 1K minified to the bundle size, and I didn't want all our users to have that extra size by default. So after some discussion, what I did was I added an alternate entry point to React-Redux that would import the shim package instead of the code directly from React 18. And the idea was that if you're still on React 17 or 16, but you want to use React-Redux version 8, you could import, you would probably use your bundler to alias this new compat entry point. So your code would still say import, use selector from React-Redux, but the bundler would go and import it from the compat entry point instead. It pulls in the shim, and that way it still works with the older versions of React. One other thing that I added during the version 8 development work was some special Ssr related support. So in Ssr, the standard pattern is that you create a Redux store on the server, maybe fetch some data, prepare the data, render the initial UI with React and the store, and then you serialize the Redux state, put it in the page, and you use that as the preloaded state on the client to reload the store and do the initial hydration render, and React picks up where it's left off. Well, the problem is that if there is a mismatch in the data or the rendering on the client, especially in React 18, React doesn't like that and starts complaining that there's mismatches in the hydration. So in React 18, especially with the useSyncExternalStore hook, you can pass in an extra option to useSyncExternalStore that says, here is a copy of known state from the server, and if React is doing a hydration related first render, it will make sure that it consistently uses that server state all the way through the rendering process. So in order to support this for React-Redux, what I did was I added a new server state prop to the provider component, and that gets passed into useSyncExternalStore internally, and that seems to have solved some hydration issues with React-Redux. But in all honesty, I really haven't tested it out this far, other than one tiny little example project. Right now, there's no real tests in the code base that actually do anything for this. So the last thing that came up just a few days ago, let's see. So React 18 finally came out live in production earlier this week. And the next day we started getting error reports because people trying to create a new Create React app project were getting installation errors. And the issue is that CRA always tries to install the latest versions of React before it even looks at whatever template you're trying to use. And our templates are still saying use React-Redux version 7. And React-Redux version 7 has a peer dependency of React 16 or 17. Well, the current versions of the npm package manager they always try to install peer dependencies, and they throw errors if the peer dependencies mismatch. So CRA was creating a project and adding React 18. CRA would then try to install the Redux template. npm would say, okay, React Redux version 7. This needs React 17, but React 18's here. Oops, panic. And people were getting errors, and it wouldn't actually create the project. So I ended up having to put out a patch version of React Redux that says it's compatible with React 18, even though it's really not what we actually want people using. But I realized that there was a bigger problem. React Native isn't going to have support for React 18 for, I don't know, some unknown amount of time. Apparently, this is tied into the whole new React Native architecture rewrite that they're working on. So if I were to release React Redux version 8 like in the next couple weeks, and it were to be React 18 only, it would basically stop working with React Native right away, and that would be bad. So I talked about this with the React team the other night, and we agreed that it would be best if React Redux version 8 does actually use the shim by default for maximum compatibility. So that means that there will be a little extra bundle size by default, but there's a few different trade-offs here. We did actually make useSelector itself a lot smaller because it no longer has that subscription logic built into our own code. So the actual source code size in the library shrank. We're putting back that plus just a little bit with use of the shim. So in the end, it's probably not going to be that much bigger than React Redux version 7 was. This does mean that React Redux version 8 will work out of the box with any version of React that has hooks. And that's probably a good thing for adoption because it means you can upgrade to React Redux version 8 even if you are still on React 16 or 17. And it also means that it'll work out of the box with React Native. So what I'd like to try and do today is actually flip the implementation behavior to where it's got the shim by default, and there is still an alternate entry point, but that alternate entry point is now the one that does not have the shim, and you can do the aliasing in your bundler if you want to, and actually if you are actually using React 18 and try and shave off those few extra bytes out of the bundle size. So that's the general goal here. Tell you what, let me stand up and stretch for a couple minutes, a couple minute break. I'll be right back, and then we'll actually try diving into the code, see what it looks like, and start trying to actually make some changes. So back in a couple minutes. All right, let's do this. So next step is to actually dive right into the code. Let's look at the implementation for a couple minutes, and then I will start trying to actually change this as we go. So let's actually start with a quick comparison of what useSelector looks like in version 7 compared to version 8. So in version 7, which I've got up here, useSelector is about 165 lines, although a decent chunk of that is comments. And you can see the actual store and subscription logic here in this function called useSelector with store and subscription. And you can see that we've got to do a bunch of work around being able to re-render the component, managing the actual subscription to the store, doing the equality checks and the comparisons to call the selector and see if the results have actually changed, saving a bunch of values for the current state for comparisons, and actually managing the subscription, turning on, checking for updates, and unsubscribing when the component unmounts. So let's see what that actually looks like with version 8. So the first thing you'll see is that, hey, the code is in TypeScript now. This is wonderful. But the second thing you'll see is, oh, hey, look, useSelector basically does almost nothing by itself at this point. useSyncExternalStore does basically all the work for us now. So we pass in some methods like, here's a function that the hook can call to add a subscription. Here's the function that it can call to get the current data. Here's a function to get some server state. Here's the actual selector. Here's an equality function if one was provided. And useSyncExternalStore actually does the rest for us. So, the code shrank a lot. The complexity of the code shrank a lot. Really, if anything, the only reason this file is still got some size to it is because we added some additional debug checks and whatnot. But yeah, that really is the bulk of it at this point. We now delegate all the work to useSyncExternalStore. So as far as using the shim versus not using the shim, if you look at our source code right now, the way I've got it split up is there are actually now 3 different entry point files sitting here in the root of the source code. The primary one is currently configured to import useSyncExternalStore directly from React. So we technically depend on the useSyncExternalStore package already. useSyncExternalStore actually has 2 pairs of entry points. There's one pair of entry points that provides the baseline useSyncExternalStore function, one with the shim and one without the shim that just directly imports it from React. There's another pair of entry points that provide an extra function called useSyncExternalStore with selector, which has some extra logic for calling a selector, running an equality function. In other words, basically the work that useSelector was doing itself previously. So the main entry point right now, source/index.ts, is importing this useSyncExternalStore with selector function, and try saying that a few times quickly, from the entry point that ultimately pulls this directly from React without adding the shim in between. And because we need to be able to call this, I'm actually injecting that function into the useSelector file and then the baseline function into the connect file so that they actually have the hooks that they're supposed to be able to call. Alternately, this compat entry point is importing those same functions, but from the shim entry points in the package. And finally, there's an alternate renderers entry point. Now, when we think of React, we normally think of React DOM and React Native. And that probably is like 98% of React usage right there. But there are other React renderers as well. For example, React 3 Fiber, which lets you do a bunch of 3.js WebGL drawing. Ink and React Blessed, which let you do console text UIs based on React. And the problem is that React-Redux needs to be able to use batching behavior. And the batching is unfortunately exported from the renderer itself. And so we need to figure out at runtime, like, well, really almost at build, as the application is being built, where we're importing the batching logic from. And we know that React DOM and React Native both export a function called unstable batched updates. And so we can import one of those from React DOM, we can import one of those from React Native, but we don't know if other renderers like React 3 Fiber or React Blessed or React Ink actually have a similar function. So the idea is if you're using React-Redux with a different React renderer, you would want to import useSelector or connect from this alternate entry point instead. So right now, alternate renderers is already using the shim. This compat entry point is using the shim, and our index file is not using the shim. So really what I want to do here is I basically just want to switch these couple different import lines and go with that instead. For that matter, I'm probably also going to want to update the final versions that we've got in here. Yeah, right now I've got the RC versions of useSyncExternalStore and React is, and and as dev dependencies, I've got some beta versions installed. So we're definitely going to want to update all those packages. So time for the live coding part of this exercise. Let's see. The side question from the gallery. Are named args now a thing in TypeScript? Talking about function and new batch. No, it's not a named function. I'm literally just giving the type of the argument. So this is normal TypeScript type syntax. I'm saying that the new batch variable has a type, and the type of this argument is grabbing this other type over here. Let's see, in alternate renderers. Not quite following the question. Okay. So I guess you're asking about like within this type definition. I think that's just TypeScript being kind of smart and saying, here's the variable name within the parameter list. Let's see. Yeah, like literally I named the variable over here, fn. And so here, when I hover over the signature, TypeScript is just telling me that is the name of the actual variable that gets used inside that function. Okay, so I think the first thing I want to do is I actually want to go through here and just update all the React-related packages to actually be version 18.0. Or in the case of useSyncExternalStore, 1.0. And React greater than 18 there. Okay, and I never got around to adding that. Okay, so we've got our changes. And let's just actually make sure that all the tests actually still pass. So one thing I did during the development process, oh my, that's not a good sign. I was really not expecting to see that. Okay. I probably am going to need to update React testing library. Yeah. Okay. Let me back up and go through the explanation I was about to give. So I mentioned earlier that this compat entry point was supposed to provide support for working with React all the way back to 16.8. But how do you actually test that? If all of our code has been updated to try to work with React 18, how do you run the tests against an older version of React, and how do you have the code itself use the compat entry point instead? So what I did was I went into our jest configuration and I came up with an alternate jest config that overrides what versions of React we're using. If you look in package.json, you'll see that under our dev dependencies, I've installed React as a package named React at version 18, but I also installed a copy of React 17 under a different package name of React-17. Same thing for React DOM and React Test Renderer and I believe React Testing Library as well. So inside of the jest config, I created an alternate config that looks for anywhere that we're importing React and aliases that to React 17. And the idea was that I wanted to run the exact same tests, but I wanted to target the compat entry point and I wanted to target React 17. And so if you look at the test runs here, you'll see that it ran. Okay, yes, we get the idea. Things aren't cooperating. You'll see that it, for example, ran some of the tests, or it ran all the tests against React 18 with all the useSyncExternalStore code. And then it ran the test against React 17 with the shim code in place. And this was working just fine the last time I ran it. Unfortunately, one of the late changes in React 18, right before they released the final version, React 18 changes how you're supposed to set up the store. Instead of importing React DOM and calling reactdom.render, you're now supposed to import a function called createRoot from React DOM/client. And because that was a last minute change, you can technically import createRoot from the base React DOM package, but it starts yelling at you if you do that. So what I think is going on here is that right now I'm using a version of React testing library that's a few months old, and that was before the React team made this change. So I'm going to need to go look and see what the latest version of testing library/React is. Okay, 13.0, 3 days ago. So let's update that. Yeah, you can see I was still on Alpha 4. So let's update that and see if that hopefully fixes our test issues. Fingers crossed. Oh, that is, well, mostly better. Anyway. Let's see, what else? Okay, that's distinctly better. Updating to React Testing Library 13 final fixed all the issues because React Testing Library is the one that's actually importing create root. The one thing that I'm seeing here is, oh, it's the ever popular test not wrapped in act error. Wonderful. Okay, so let me save the changes to, let's see, React Testing Library. And then let's see if we can go fix whatever that not wrapped in act error is. React DOM connect.spec line 825. That's interesting. Why is there the line mismatch here? Okay. Those look like they should be wrapped in act right there. Okay, let's try running that test again. And again, you'll notice this is running both the React 18 version and the React 17 version right here. Hi, honey. Apparently you didn't know I was streaming today. Apparently you need to pay more attention to my Twitter feed. Okay, so good news is I think we're back to having all the tests actually passing on this branch, which is good because if I'm going to actually start moving code around, I really want the tests passing first. Okay, so I think I'm ready to actually start trying to swap over the shim behavior here. So the good news is I don't think the actual change is going to be too hard. This does kind of bring up the question of how the test behavior is supposed to work, though. So right now, the primary set of tests are testing against React 18. And there's a compat entry point that is testing against React 17. I suppose one option would be to flip that so that our primary tests really are still using React 17. But that feels kind of weird. Like, I would really like to be testing against React 18 in practice, even if the not entirely sure how I want to handle this test setup here. We'll figure that part out in a couple minutes. Okay. So this comment is now pretty much obsolete. Let's see. Oh, this is another question. What are the React types like at this point? Type/React. What are we? 17035. Okay, there is a newer version. I know I saw some discussion on Reddit when React 18 came out that said that the final version of the React 18 types has a PR up, but it's not actually ready yet. Yeah, let's at least bump the types to the latest version and go with that. Great. How many different types we have here? React, React DOM, React is 14. Is 1703. I don't think that's changed. Yeah, okay. Okay, we'll commit that. So I'm curious. I have a TS ignore there. Does that still error? Okay, that's a good sign. So it's always nice when you can strip out a TS ignore from the code base. And that looks good. Actually, do we have type? Oh, we have let's check the types for those. Okay, that hasn't changed. Good. Okay, so what I probably want to do is just jump over to this compat entry point, copy these, and swap. Primary. You know, it's really hard to actually read comments like as I'm streaming and trying to read this stuff out loud. Let's see, primary entry point assumes working with standard. Okay, yep, that conceptually makes sense. Let's see. So we have the shim by default. And actually that comment makes sense. Okay, so now comes one of the hardest problems in programming, naming. So I've got this entry point called compat. So you would use it as import use selector from React-Redux /compat, or more likely you would actually have an alias for this in your bundler. I'm not sure compat is a good name now that this is actually the React 18 specific entry point. If anybody has suggestions for what this entry point should be named now that this is actually targeting React 18, I'm very much open to suggestions here. Like, I could just leave it as compat for now. I could call it like /React18. I could call it like no shim or something like that. Frankly, I'm not really thrilled with any of those names. Slim. Yeah, I'm actually not sure, and legitimately, if anyone has suggestions for what we ought to call this right now in the chat, I'm very much interested. Okay, so in theory, those were the only changes I needed to make there. Comment from the chat. React Router went with something like React Router 5 compat. Yeah, but the problem is this is actually flipping it around. Like they released a package that was specifically for backwards compatibility. Here, this entry point is specifically for forwards compatibility. Our default entry point is the one that assumes you might still be using an older version of React. And it's this newer entry point that is the one that only works with React 18. So that's why I'm like waffling so much on what a good name should be. Ooh, okay. Alternate suggestion. Call it next. You know what? I like that. It's short, it's snappy. Let's do that. Okay, so those should be few enough changes that get correctly to text. This is a rename. So let's swap. Okay. You might notice I'm a firm believer in commit early and commit often. I don't necessarily follow the commit early part a lot. It's very common that I end up with like dozens of files touched in like on disk at once, especially if I'm working on an actual application and I'm busy refactoring a bunch of things. But very firm believer in breaking things into very small, focused commits if possible. Okay, so now we've got the problem that the test setup is flipped because I've got this compat entry config that is the one that's targeting React 17, but it's using the compat entry point. Well, number one, there isn't a compat entry point anymore. And number two, that file is the one that now targets React 18. And I'm not entirely sure how I want to split this up now. See, the problem is we really have three different scenarios now. Scenario one is you're using React 18 and use the primary entry point as normal, and everything just works. Actually, well, you're using the primary entry point, which pulls in the shim, and things work. The second scenario is you're using React 16 or 17, and it pulls in the shim, and things work. The third scenario is you're using React 18, and you have specifically aliased and are pulling in the next entry point, and it skips the shim, and things should work. So I hate to say it, it almost feels like we really need to have three separate entry point like three separate test configs right now for those three scenarios. Yeah, I dislike having three separate tests because it's or test suites because it's going to make it run more. But you know what? I'd rather make sure everything works. So let's call it. Let's see. Display name. So here we're going to want to alias these things and change that. Let's see. Here, we want to remove those and call it next. Okay, so we've got our primary config, which should be normal jest, normal React. Hey, a wild Dominic just showed up. Nice. Okay, so we've got one config for standard entry point React 18 that will use the shim, one for standard entry point, but we're falling back to React 17. And then we got one for the alternate entry point, which should use React 18, but no shim. So let's see if this works. And you can't see my processor right now, but it's totally pegged. Keep going. Keep going. Sweet. Sweet. That is absolutely beautiful. Okay, I think that might actually be basically it right there, I hope. Oh yeah, I realized, sorry, I just realized that my source tree is spilling out of the visible screen area. So I actually got a new laptop a few weeks ago, and this actually has it has a screen that's a 16 by 10 resolution, and it's actually 2560 by 1600 by default. My old laptop was 1920 by 1080, so naturally just stream the whole screen. And because this one has a higher resolution and it's 16 by 10, what I've had to do is I'm using the Microsoft Fancy Zones Power Toy to set up a zone that is a 16 by 9 ratio here on the screen. And then I'm actually downscaling that to 1920 by 1080 and to stream it out. And I've got my VS Code and the browser dropped into this 16 by 9 zone so that it exactly matches the streaming area. But I realized I forgot that my source tree wasn't locked to that area, so you probably didn't see the commit messages I was typing in a couple minutes ago. Okay, so we've got the Jest configure up. Just config match. Okay, so the good news is I think that's actually all that's needed to do to swap the shim usage behavior. Okay, so if anyone has any questions on the stuff I've been doing so far, please feel free to drop them in chat. I'm happy to respond. Otherwise, I'm gonna try and go on to the next stage. So I mentioned earlier that I'd added some Ssr support to React-Redux version 8, and I actually have no real practical experience with React-Redux and Ssr behavior myself. I've never actually tried to do that stuff before. There's been some good discussions in here, and I'm looking for one of them in particular. Let's see. Maybe it was a thread that was over here in the Redux toolkit area. Okay, I may be mixing up some of my memory of different threads here. So this PR that I did all the way back in November, actually, I added this new server state prop to React 18, or to the provider component. And let's look at what the actual change here looked like at that point in time. So the idea is that provider itself now has an optional prop called server state. And the idea is you're supposed to take the Redux state that you serialized and like put in, the global namespace in the page as it's loading, pass that into provider. And let's find the actual relevant changes. Let's see. Is use selector. Looking. Okay, so the provider component is already putting the Redux store and a React-Redux subscription instance into context and passing these down for Redux connected components to use. So what I did was I added a third field to that context object called getServerState. And if you have passed a server state prop into provider, it's going to create a function that just literally returns whatever prop you passed in as server state and make that available for child components to read. Inside of useSelector, it tries to grab that out, and then if it exists, it will pass it to useSyncExternalStore. If React detects that it is doing an initial hydration render, useSyncExternalStore will prefer grabbing the state that it's checking from this argument instead of grabbing it from the second argument, which is what it would normally use. And the idea is that if in normal behavior, what useSyncExternalStore does is as it's progressing through the render pass, it can determine inside of this hook whether the data returned by this function has changed. And if it has, it will actually throw away the render pass and start over. It's actually kind of a relatively expensive way of making sure that everything is consistent, but the idea is we don't know what might be inconsistent because the data has changed. It's better to start over and work from scratch. If it's doing a hydration render, it will try to read its data from this alternate method instead, and it will make sure that it consistently uses that all the way through. So the idea is if React's doing a hydration pass, it always reads the data from this argument, make sure that everything lines up, and this should be the same state that you used on the server, so all the UI output should be exactly the same, and ideally this will avoid some hydration mismatches. So the thing is, I made these changes and I put them out, and I really haven't tested them besides having just a quick little example project on my own computer. I don't have any tests for this right now. And it would be good to try to actually have some kind of a test in here if possible. Now, trying to remember how I actually did some tests for this in the first place. And I know I had a little example project on my old laptop, and I don't think I ended up copying over that example project to the new laptop, which is annoying because that would have been really convenient to try and play with. But I believe somewhere in here, there were links to a couple of Ssr related examples. Okay, so what did we have actually mentioned over here? So we started with the sandbox that should showcase progressive hydration and Linea's quick component. So ideally what I would like to have is at least one test that actually tries to mimic an SSR related scenario. Um, so what does this actually include? Okay, I vaguely remember looking at this a few months ago. Like this was all the way back in November. And I'm pretty sure I remember seeing those buttons. So this looks vaguely familiar. I don't remember whether I was trying out my React Redux build. Yeah, I must have cloned this locally in order to try it out because I was generating some local builds of React Redux and trying it out. Pull this down and play around with this for a few minutes. Oh, hey, look, maybe I was actually smart enough. Okay, maybe I did actually persist some of this information when I moved over laptops because look, there's the exact same zip file and the exact same Oh, good for me. I actually did copy this over when I switched laptops. Yay, I don't have to create all the. Ah, yes, I suppose it actually helps if you actually install the projects first. And that's certainly an issue. Okay, so when I'm doing local tests of a project, I normally or local builds of a library. I normally use a package called Yalk, and let's see, we want 8.0 beta.3, I think. Okay. This is running where? Localhost 4000. Okay, so what I think I was doing here previously was testing this out, and if we were using the version of React Redux prior to adding that server state prop, there would be some kind of error in here. So let me actually try dropping back to either beta 1 or beta 2. Let's see. Let's see, beta 3 fixed unsubscribe. Beta 2 had SSR. Beta 1, yeah. Aha, yeah, okay. So this is what I was seeing before I added the SSR compatibility prop. We have these lovely React hydration errors saying that there's a mismatch between what was rendered on the client and what had been sent over from the server. And that's because there was a difference in the data that was being used to render that on the client. Okay, so we know that Beta 3 appears to fix that issue. Yep, loads and no warnings. So now comes the part where I'm actually not sure how much meaningful progress I'm going to be able to make here. Partly because honestly, when I'm trying to live narrate this stuff, it's a whole lot harder for me to actually focus and think about these things. I'm definitely one of those people who needs my music going and like not actually talking to people in order to be able to focus on stuff and make progress. So we may end up calling a halt on this one here shortly. But the immediate question would be, what is this project doing for SSR related rendering? And how could I try to mimic that in a test? Comment from chat. Thanks for showing the combination of just projects, module name mapper, and multiple versions of React. You're welcome. That was an interesting one to figure out, and it was really, really nice that I actually did get that working. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple minutes just to skim through this example of the server and see what it's doing to actually render things. Ideally, what I would want to do is kind of try and copy paste some of this into one of our tests, but I'm not sure how feasible that is right now. And I suspect it's probably something that would take more attention than I can give during a stream to try to make that happen. So let's see. So we have a fairly typical Express app. If we're asking for JS code, it's going to fake it. Get some Express setup, handle errors, wait for Webpack, and otherwise it tries to use a render function. So what is this doing? So we create a Redux store with a reducer. We pretend to load some fake data inside of here. And then we're calling React's render to pipeable stream function. An app component, store, initial state, and a bunch of options that I've never seen before. Like I said, I have no practical experience doing SSR or streaming HTML or any of this stuff. I've read some discussions, but this is really all pretty much brand new to me. So we have rendered a pipeable stream. We get a pipe. We're passing an onComplete shell function to render the pipeable stream. and then we hook together pipe and the response. Okay, I sort of see what this is doing, but I'm going to say that this is the wrong time for me to actually try and convert that into a test. I would really need to spend some more time going through this in detail and trying to figure out what it's actually doing, and then figure out how to move it over into a test. Um, Frankly, if anyone actually has experience with this stuff and would like to try making it into a test for me, that would be really, really nice, so I don't have to try and mess with this one myself. Um, I actually have halfway decent confidence that the SSR, that server state prop that I added is actually doing something, because we saw in that, like when I loaded up that example, beta 1 shows the hydration warning, beta 3 does not, and all I changed really in between was adding the server state prop and passing that down through. Yeah, so here you can see in this example app, when we render the provider component, we pass in the store as usual, but then we try to pass in server state if it exists. Yeah, tell you what, it's about 2:30 Eastern. It's been about an hour and a half, and I don't think I'm really actually going to try and dive in and do any further test related work here. This is probably a good time to call it for today. Does anyone have any questions on what's inside of Redux version 8? What I was doing there with the shim switch, how the SSR prop is supposed to work. Any questions like that I can try to answer? Going once, going twice. No questions. How many people actually showed up today anyway? We got a few. I'll be honest, like, it still amuses me that anybody wants to see me actually talk about any of this stuff. Like, I get kind of into it, but it doesn't, like, I realize that most other people are probably, you know, they have actual lives and aren't really interested in this sort of thing. So the fact that anyone shows up for these streams is still amusing to me, and I appreciate it. All right, so we'll call it here for today. I will hopefully actually put out React-Redux version 8 beta 4 here in the next hour or two. Just want to make double check that I've got things and then put it out there. I would actually request, especially now that React 18 is actually out, like, please actually go ahead and try out version 8 beta in your apps with React 18, like right now, or well, or at least as soon as beta 4 is out. Honestly, realistically, I feel pretty good about it. I don't expect that like anything is majorly broken. I don't think we're really going to need to make any other changes, but we really haven't gotten very much feedback at all about actually using them together. So having some people try this out and just giving us a thumbs up and saying that it works, looks good, would be really, really appreciated. I would like to try to release version 8 final within the next week or two, but it really depends on frankly how much feedback we get, if there are any other changes that need to be made, that sort of thing. But I would like to try and get this out fairly soon. At that point, we'll need to update our Create React app templates and all that kind of stuff. So, all right, that's all for today. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you all later, hopefully.